Hi, I'm Charles Fisher, the founder and CEO at Unlearn AI. Today I'm going to tell you about how we are accelerating clinical trials using a new technology based on artificial intelligence called a digital twin. But more than just accelerating clinical trials, I'm going to tell you how we can run robust, reliable clinical trials in a fraction of the time. To frame the problem, we all know that clinical trials are a slow and risky and expensive process, but the extent of that is really astounding. Only 10% of drugs that enter in human clinical trials end up earning FDA approval. 20% of clinical trials totally fail to achieve patient enrollment targets, and 80% of clinical trials experience delays in enrollment. In this extensive investment and this long period of time is on top of increasing competition and decreasing periods of exclusivity for pharma companies. Of course, maybe more importantly, this is also a delay in the time it takes to get effective drugs to patients who need them. In one particular area where we desperately need new technologies is Alzheimer's disease. Despite tremendous investment from the research and academic and pharmaceutical communities over the last couple of decades, there haven't been any new disease-modifying therapies approved in Alzheimer's in over 15 years. And clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease are incredibly long and expensive. A typical phase 3 trial enrolls more than 800 patients, takes more than 4 years to run, and costs over $200 million. And anything that we can do to leverage new technologies to speed research in Alzheimer's disease up has the potential to lead to new treatments that may finally move the needle for patients. And we've developed an approach that leverages artificial intelligence and historical longitudinal patient data sets to create digital twins and incorporate those digital twins into clinical trials in areas like Alzheimer's disease. In this proprietary AI-driven approach that uses digital twins and a statistical method I'll talk about later called PROCOVA can enable substantially faster AD clinical trials. Our proposal for statistical analysis plans for phase 3 Alzheimer's trials can reduce the number of subjects by up to 20%. Whereas for phase 2 trials, we can reduce the number of subjects by up to 66%. These are trials that are substantially smaller, substantially more efficient, but still provide robust, reliable, easily interpretable results about treatment efficacy and safety. Let me explain how that works. It comes down to bringing together two different technologies. One we call a digital twin, and the other is called Prognostic Covariate Adjustment, or PROCOVA. And these two technologies were designed, they were invented to work together. So what is a clinical trial? What is a digital twin, and how do they fit together? Well, in Alzheimer's disease, or really in most therapeutic areas, a clinical trial aims to determine if a new treatment performs better than placebo. And to do this, we are going to compare two potential outcomes. There is the outcome of what would happen to this patient if they are randomized to the active treatment group, versus the other outcome of what would happen if they were randomized to the placebo group. And it is the difference between those two potential outcomes averaged over the patient population that we call a treatment effect. That's what we want to estimate. And even though we can only obtain data on the response of a patient to the active treatment by actually giving that treatment to a patient, observing what happens, there is already a lot of longitudinal patient data from previously completed clinical trials, from real-world sources, observational studies on how patients with AD respond to placebo and or the current standard of care. And how can we leverage those data and incorporate them into a clinical trial safely to make that trial more efficient? So we use an approach called deep learning to create disease progression models. So longitudinal disease progression models trained on databases of longitudinal patient data, where we can predict how a patient will progress on placebo. And we call that predicted placebo progression for a patient his or her digital twin. So before a trial starts, we have collected data from thousands of patients. We have followed those patients for multiple years. And we have trained a deep learning model that can then take in the data from at baseline from a new patient and then output predictions for how all of those different patient characteristics will vary over time. And that's what we call the digital twin. Here's an example of a digital twin for a patient with Alzheimer's disease that we have created with our platform. It is a prediction of how that patient's disease will progress if they are given a placebo. And you can see that there are large numbers of different patient characteristics, some of which are just measured at baseline, such as these at the top, demographic variables, sex, genetic characteristics. And then there are a whole bunch of other characteristics that we want to predict how they will evolve over the course of the trial, such as the individual components of cognitive scores, blood tests, etc. And all of these background variables and all of the time-dependent variables are measured at baseline, input into the pre-trained AI model, and it outputs predictions, a predicted disease progression for this patient across time. And this is done at baseline as each patient enrolls into a trial in a blinded fashion. So we're having patients who are enrolling. Their baseline data are collected, input into this pre-specified, pre-trained AI model, which then makes this prediction, a prediction of disease progression on placebo. Then that patient is randomized to receive the active or control treatment. So every single patient in the study is given a digital twin who predicts their disease progression in a blinded fashion. So this is still within the generic framework of a double-blinded randomized controlled trial. And let me contrast that with another approach to bringing in external data into a clinical trial. You may have heard of something called a synthetic control arm. And in this approach, we might take data from an external source, maybe a previously run clinical trial or a real-world data source, match those patients based on some baseline characteristics. So maybe take the patients who meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria of our current trial, and then just sort of shove those external patients into the control arm of the trial and analyze this trial as if it had more patients than it really had. That's different from what we are talking about with digital twins. A digital twin isn't a new patient. It is additional information about one of the patients who is in the trial. It is a prediction of how that patient would progress if they were to receive placebo. And it is added into the trial not as new patients, but as new covariates, new measurements made about individual patients. And this is critically important. The approach that we're describing for incorporating digital twins into clinical trials, which we call PROCOVA, Prognostic Covariate Adjustment, is supported by regulatory guidance from the European Medicines Agency and the US Food and Drug Administration because it's able to control the type 1 error rate of a trial. It does not bias the outcome of the trial. It only produces more confident estimates of treatment effects. Synthetic controls, on the other hand, do run the risk of biasing the results of a clinical trial. So it's critically important that we develop not only approaches to create digital twins, but approaches that can leverage those digital twins to create better clinical trials that are still reliable. And we can put this kind of on a 2x2 axis. So here along the x-axis, we have the maximum type 1 error rate. So the likelihood we may have a false positive result if we are testing a drug that does not really work. And along the y-axis, we can plot the minimum sample size that would be required to see a interesting treatment effect. And we have a normal randomized controlled trial here, which has a particular type 1 error rate, say 5%. And then we have a single-arm trial, so something like a synthetic control. Many fewer patients, but now we run the risk of adding some bias. We may potentially have a false positive. By incorporating digital twins with PROCOVA into a randomized control trial, we decrease the minimum sample size, but we do not add any bias. However, if we want to go a little bit farther, say for an early stage clinical trial, we can add in additional information about how accurate we believe the model to be using Bayesian approaches. Basically, we can measure the accuracy of the disease progression model used to create digital twins. And if it's very accurate, we borrow more and more information. And as long as we don't borrow too much information from that model, then we still have reasonable approximate control of the type 1 error rate, but can reduce sample sizes significantly more. And that's how we end up with two different approaches. So for a phase 3 clinical trial, where it's critically important to control the type 1 error rate, we can use PROCOVA to incorporate digital twins and reduce the size of a phase 3 Alzheimer's clinical trial by up to 20%. Whereas for earlier stage phase 2 trials, we can use a Bayesian formulation of PROCOVA to incorporate digital twins into a clinical trial to provide substantial reductions in the minimum number of subjects by up to 66%. So if you want to learn more about how we can use artificial intelligence and statistical methods to create digital twins and to run more robust, reliable, efficient clinical trials, there are a variety of resources. First, as a general rule, our company publishes our research in top-tier peer-reviewed journals, conferences, and preprints. So you can find a number of our scientific publications that describe our AI technology, its application to Alzheimer's disease, and the statistical basis underlying PROCOVA. In addition, you can reach out to partner with us to explore how digital twins can be used to accelerate both early and late-stage clinical trials. We have a number of ways that we partner with clinical trial sponsors for early, late-stage clinical trials, whether that's in starting from the beginning and helping to design a more efficient clinical trial, all the way to doing post-hoc analyses to identify subgroups with higher power. And if you're not a clinical trial sponsor, but are still interested in other ways to explore research collaborations or other ways to work together, please reach out. We have many ways that we are interested in partnering with people across the ecosystem. And you can reach out by sending me an email to drckf@unlearn.ai, or just go to our website, www.unlearn.ai, and reach out from there. Thank you.